In a previous unit, we learned that the localized electron model views a molecule as a collection of atoms bound together by sharing electrons between their atomic orbitals. The arrangement of the valence electrons is represented by the Lewis structure, and the molecular geometry can be predicted from the VSEPR model. In this unit, we will describe atomic orbitals used to share electrons and form bonds. Let's reconsider a familiar molecule in methane. We assume that bonding involves only the valence orbitals. This means that hydrogen uses 1s orbitals and carbon uses 2s and 2p orbitals. Using the 2p and 2s orbitals will lead to two different types of carbon-hydrogen bonds. First, overlap of a hydrogen 1s orbital and a carbon 2p orbital, and a second type with overlap of a carbon 2s with a hydrogen 1s. This is a problem because experimentally methane has been found to have 4 identical carbon-hydrogen bonds. Either the localized electron model is wrong, or carbon adopts a set of atomic orbitals other than its native 2s and 2p orbitals to bond to the hydrogen atoms in forming methane. To account for the known structure of methane, we assume that the carbon atom has 4 equivalent atomic orbitals arranged tetrahedrally. A set of orbitals can be obtained by combining the carbon 2s and 2p orbitals. This combination is called hybridization and is the mixing of native orbitals to form special orbitals that are used for bonding. One example of this hybridization is producing sp3 orbitals, which are formed from 1 2s and 3 2p orbitals. Any atom that undergoes this process is said to be sp3 hybridized. If we look at this in a diagram format, we can see the individual orbitals, and then after the hybridization, we have 4 sp3 orbitals that are identical in shape, which looks like a large lobe and a small lobe. And when the 4 lobes are oriented in space, they form a tetrahedral arrangement. Another way to represent this hybridization is with an orbital energy level diagram. You can see on the left, the individual orbitals in a free carbon atom have differing energies. But after the hybridization, the 4 sp3 orbitals in the methane molecule have equal energy. A key principle in this type of hybridization is that whenever an atom requires a set of equivalent tetrahedral atomic orbitals, this model assumes that the atom adopts a set of sp3 orbitals. Let's attempt to apply this model to describe the bonding in an ammonia molecule. When we add up the valence electrons and draw the molecule, the Lewis structure for ammonia looks like this. The 4 electron pairs around the nitrogen require a tetrahedral arrangement to minimize the electron repulsions. So in this case, a tetrahedral set of sp3 orbitals is needed by combining the 2s and the 3 2p orbitals. In the ammonia molecule, then, 3 of the sp3 orbitals are used to form the bonds to the 3 hydrogen atoms, and the 4th sp3 orbital holds the lone pair. Let's consider another familiar molecule, which is ethylene. If we look at the shape of this molecule, each of the carbon atoms has 3 electron regions around it, which would produce a trigonal planar shape. What would the angle then be around the carbon atoms? Well, in order to minimize repulsions and for them to be equally distributed in 3-dimensional space, there will be an angle of 120 degrees. Unfortunately, the sp3 hybridization would not work in the ethylene molecule. There's another type of hybridization called sp2, which results from 1 2s and 2 2p orbitals. This will produce the needed trigonal planar arrangement of the orbitals and the bond angle of 120 degrees. Again, we can consider the individual orbitals and their shapes, and then after hybridization we have 3 equal orbitals, and they are arranged with that trigonal planar shape. Considering again the energy diagram, you can see the isolated orbitals with their differing energies, and then after the hybridization we have 3 equal energy sp2 orbitals and an additional higher energy 2p orbital. With sp2 hybridization, there's always a 2p orbital that is not used and is oriented perpendicular to the plane of the other sp2 orbitals. Now let's consider the types of bonds that can be formed by these differing types of orbitals. A sigma bond is formed by sharing electrons in the area centered on a line running between the atoms. For the ethylene molecule, these bonds are formed using the sp2 orbitals on each carbon and the 1s orbital on each hydrogen atom. This helps with the single bond, but how can we explain the double bond between the carbon atoms? The second bond must result from sharing an electron pair in the space above and below the sigma bond. This type of bond can be formed using the 2p orbital perpendicular to the sp2 hybrid orbitals on each carbon atom. This produces something called a pi bond. It is parallel unhybridized p orbitals that share an electron occupying the space above and below the sigma bond. Anytime a double bond is formed in a molecule, it always consists of one sigma bond and one pi bond. So if we consider ethylene yet again, you can see the green sp2 orbitals around the carbon. One is being used to share electrons between the carbons for the single bond. The other two are sharing electrons with the hydrogen 1s orbital. We have this leftover p orbital, which is going to share electrons above and below the molecule, and that is the pi bond of the double bond. A key principle in sp2 hybridization is that if an atom is surrounded by 3 different electron regions, a set of sp2 hybrid orbitals is required. All right, let's consider a third familiar molecule, which is the carbon dioxide molecule. The shape of this molecule is linear, and the approximate bond angle around the carbon atom is 180 degrees. So neither of the previous 2 hybrid orbitals will fit with this molecule. This brings about the idea of sp hybridization, where we combine one s and one p orbital, which produces the needed linear arrangement of the atomic orbitals. We have 2 effective electron regions around the atom will always require this type of hybridization. You will see in the next slide that 2 of the 2p orbitals are not used, and again they're going to be used to form pi bonds. Here is a look at the shapes. Again, we have an individual s and individual p, and after they're hybridized into the shape of the sp orbital. Orbital energy, again, we can see on the left differing energies after the hybridization, 2 equivalent sp orbitals, and then the 2p orbitals that are left over. If we look at this in a diagram form, there's a lot to see here. You can see in the center the 2 sp orbitals of the carbon atom are sharing electrons and form sigma bonds with the sp2 orbitals on the 2 oxygen atoms. If we look at the oxygen atoms, they have 3 electron regions around them, which requires that trigonal planar arrangement we talked about earlier, or the sp2 hybridization. So you can see the sp2 is sharing with the carbon sp. The remaining 2 sp2 orbitals on the oxygen atoms are going to hold lone pairs. And again, we have a p orbital on each oxygen that is not being used. If we look at them separately again, the sp hybridized carbon atom has 2 unhybridized and unused p orbitals, whereas the oxygen has 1 unused p orbitals. The carbon is going to use each of its unused orbitals to form a double pi bond with each of the other oxygen atoms. So here's the molecule all together. Again, you can see the sigma bonds that are formed between the sp orbital on the carbon and the sp2 orbital on the oxygen. Here are our lone pair holding sp2 orbitals on the oxygen, and then the unused sp2 is forming a pi bond with this carbon, and then the unused p orbital is forming another pi bond with the central carbon. Again, let's apply our new understanding to trying to describe the bonding in a nitrogen molecule. When we add up the electrons and draw the structure of nitrogen, it looks like this. Each nitrogen is surrounded by 2 effective electron regions, which is going to produce a linear arrangement requiring oppositely directed orbitals. So this molecule will again require the sp hybridization. Each nitrogen atom has 2 sp hybrid orbitals and 2 of the unchanged orbitals. The sp orbitals are going to form the sigma bond between the nitrogen atoms and then hold the lone pairs on the outside. The other unused p orbitals form the 2 pi bonds. So a triple bond is going to consist of a single bond and 2 pi bonds. So you can see all this in the diagram here on the side. Here's our hybridized sp orbitals. One is sharing electrons between the molecules. You have the others that are holding the lone pairs. The 2 unused p orbitals are forming 2 pi bonds to result in our triple bond.